Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Gave Aizawa a Notebook? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. When Midoriya Izuku was 5, he was proclaimed quirkless. What this meant in modern society was that he would never amount to anything. He was, as his best friend, Kaken, said, a useless Deku. His hero dreams would never come true. He would never be able to stand anywhere near his idol outside of some cosplayer at a fan convention, and he would be left in the dust as his peers became incredible before they even knew they were incredible. The dust would have settled and been nothing more than a faint memory by the time they realized they might be slightly as amazing as they were. When Midoriya Izuku was 5, the week after he was told that he was quirkless. The week after his dreams shattered before his eyes. The week after he quickly became worthless in the eyes of his few friends. The week after Kaken went from playful little love taps to full-on fists backed by explosions. The week after Midoriya Izuku was proclaimed quirkless, there was a doctor that had been arrested for carelessness which resulted in a patient losing their life. This doctor had multiple counts where he hadn't properly looked into a patient, where he had simply glanced at evidence in front of him and waved it off as worthless, and it had finally resulted in the loss of an influential member of society. Thus, this doctor was arrested, carted off to holding so he could face a lawful trial. Before this doctor had been taken away, however, he had burned the information of all the patients he hadn't cared enough to look at. So the authorities couldn't find all the cases. They couldn't inform all of these potentially endangered patients that they should look into a more reputable source, one that would look into their case and find what was truly wrong with them. They could only rely on news channels to notify the public, but only one news channel aired it. A news channel that Midoriya Inko had never heard of. When Midoriya Izuku was 6, he had a migraine. However, he had assumed it was simply because Kaken had hit him too hard and it would go away. With time, it did go away. But afterwards, it felt as though everything moved too slowly for Izuku. His school was never a challenge anymore, as he was able to finish his homework before the teacher finished passing it out. The insults had changed quickly after the other students had found out about his grades being impeccable, straight 100s, to be honest, and he soon found himself being called a nerd. Someone had once even asked if he needed to go get glasses, since he was such a nerd. But when the school physical came around, prompting him to take an eye exam, he saw everything. Out of curiosity, the nurse practitioner that had volunteered to do the tests to get some extra credit for his college courses had taken the chart down and moved it further away, but Midoriya could see it as clearly as though it were less than a foot away, until the man passed the 12-meter mark. Then he couldn't see the letters at all and his head hurt when he tried. The college student thought it was the coolest thing, though, so Izuku guessed that the pain was worth it to have someone smile at him like that again. His peers would be stuck on a simple math problem, when he had already figured out all the key points to it and was left either waiting for them to catch up or the teacher to move on. His mother would have an issue when trying to stack or organize something, when he would walk up like it was easier than the first level of Tetris. Someone would lose an item and couldn't find it no matter how hard they looked, when he found it like it was being held to him on a silver platter. Someone would speak to Izuku and they were just so slow, he wished he knew how to speed them up sometimes. If Izuku had not been informed that he was quirkless, he would begin thinking he had a mental quirk. But the truth of the matter, at least, to one 6-year-old Midoriya Izuku, was that he had not simply come into his quirk late. It was probably something from the pre-quirk era, something no one really studied anymore since everything could be attributed to quirks. Something like that ADFD or whatever that he had heard about in a documentary. Or, the more liked answer. He had simply found something he was good at. So he applied it to his favorite heroes, first being the current number 1 of course. As he watched the various videos that used to excite him so much, he saw everything. Every little muscle twitch as All Might fought to keep smiling, every little tear that escaped the victims as they were rescued, and every little pixel on the screen. Every little mistake. He was suddenly hit by a realization, All Might wasn't a god. He was a human. Izuku almost felt ashamed that he hadn't realized that before. All Might was not unreachable. Any person with a strength-based quirk could do what All Might does. All Might was just able to keep a smile on his face, where others failed to when stressed. All Might was able to act. Izuku walked up to his mother that night, after having rewatched all the videos with this new clarity, and nervously made a request. He had no reason to be nervous. This was his mother. The only thing she had done that went against what he thought was right was give up on him when he didn't have a quirk. That had been upsetting when it happened, but he kind of understood, in a way he didn't think any other 6, almost 7-year-old would be able to. It just made him suspicious of his supposed quirkless state, even more so than before. "Mom, can I get a notebook?" Inko kneeled in front of her son, doing her best to keep the sadness that enveloped her every time she saw him off her face, and smiled up at him. "Did you run out of notebooks for school? The school only said you should need 3, but we can get more if you need more." Izuku bit his lip before making a split-second decision. "Yeah, Kaken wanted to borrow mine. There's a couple other kids that don't have any too, can we get some for them?" Izuku had never lied to his mother before, had never had any need to, so he felt a bit guilty, but he knew this would work better than saying he wanted to analyze the heroes he could find. He knew this would keep her from being sad again. He was right as her face brightened into an easier smile. Her little Izuku, always looking out for others and helping when he could. He would have been an amazing hero, way better than those that are there for the fame and money. So she bought the notebooks. In fact, she bought 20 of them since they were on sale, handing them over to Izuku so he could bring them to the students that didn't have their own notebooks. She didn't see them anymore, aside from when Izuku was sitting in front of the computer taking notes on something, so she assumed that they were delivered well and kept from bugging her son when it looked like he was studying. When Midoriya Izuku was 8, the first nearly quirkless hero he had ever heard of began making a name for himself. Eraserhead quickly became Izuku's new favorite hero. His ability to nullify another's quirk was amazing. Izuku had 4 pages of notes on ways to implement the quirk into a fight alone, not to mention the many pages he spent analyzing each little fight he found footage of, the mistakes he found and created solutions to, the creative ways he figured out how to keep the enemies of this new hero from noticing the hero's scarf, a capture scarf. That's what the hero support item website he found called it. He ended up having a notebook for Eraserhead alone, if one ignored the few pages of analysis he had used on Present Mic. When Midoriya Izuku was 9, he met Eraserhead. "Kid, what are you doing on the streets alone?" Izuku looked up from his drawing of Eraserhead that he had crudely done, making notes on each aspect of the hero's outfit to finish off the notebook, only to meet the tired eyes of the very same hero. Not quite believing he was seeing Eraserhead, Izuku rubbed his eyes and looked back up. "Still him. It's almost midnight. Kids like you should be in bed right now. There's no school with a day off tomorrow around here." Izuku vaguely remembered the short article he had seen that had listed an Aizawa as a teacher in UA, though he hadn't quite believed it was the same man since there were no pictures and no one had stated his hero name. Maybe that was why Eraserhead knew about the schools. I'm walking home from a friend's house, Mr. Eraserhead, sir." Eyes that had been lazily looking at him before suddenly sharpened into a near glare. "Is there a reason you felt you should lie to me about that?" Izuku gulped, nervously shifting from one foot to another. "Because that's what I'm going to tell my mom when I get home?" Izuku squeaked, hugging his still-open notebook to his chest, completely forgetting the fact that the hero's name had been written on the front along with Present Mix. The glare softened a small bit when they glanced down at the cover, before returning back to the nervous kid's face. "And why are you lying to your mother about where you were?" Shoyuta, to be frank, had assumed this would be a quick check on the kid, escort them home, leave before anything troublesome happens, but it was turning out to be more effort than he thought he would be expending on it. But he didn't want this innocent-looking kid to turn into a gangster, or worse, a villain. "Because she thinks Kaken is my best friend still, and I don't want her to worry that I had been knocked out at the back of the school, 'cause he accidentally used too much of his quirk on me." Izuku's brain screeched to a halt as he realized he had just told his hero? Idol sounded like the wrong word. He didn't feel the same way towards Eraserhead as he had towards All Might a few years ago, but he couldn't think of another word since he had just told his hero that he had been beaten up. Ah man, Eraserhead was going to think he was super lame now. Instead of laughing at Izuku as the boy had gotten used to, Eraserhead relaxed almost completely. It's an act, he's trying to lower your guard so he can make fun of you more later, before motioning towards the notebook. What's that? His tone was softer, less suspicious. Don't be dumb, he's going to turn on you once he finds out you're quirkless. Izuku glanced down, face heating up as he remembered which notebook, whose notebook he was holding. It's my analysis notebook. Before any other questions could be asked, before Izuku could embarrass himself anymore, he shut the notebook and moved it towards the hero who merely raised an eyebrow. You can have it. It'll probably help you more than it'll help me. I don't have a quirk so I can't use any of these to become a hero, but since they're about you and you are a hero, obviously, you're Eraserhead, there's notes about previous fights I found footage for and ways to buff up or protect your various weaknesses and ways to use your quirk that'll put less strain on your eyes and dash. Izuku cut off his rambling, as Eraserhead's hand closed around the edge of the book. Izuku immediately let go, as though the notebook had caught on fire, before bowing deeply. I'm sorry for taking up your time, I'll go home right away, sir, and I'll make sure my quirklessness doesn't infect you. It wasn't an infectious disease, the little voice in the back of Izuku's brain hissed. It was the same voice that whispered insults and comebacks to the verbal bullying Izuku received, so it was easy to ignore it. Because if being quirkless wasn't infectious, then why was there currently a council of parents that were lobbying to have him removed from the school just because he was quirkless? He ran off, heading home immediately as he had promised, and leaving behind a bewildered and slightly overwhelmed Eraserhead. Aizawa Shoyuta was nothing if not an introvert. It was one of the reasons he had been a seemingly easy target for bullies. It was one of the reasons he had been consistently told when growing up that he would become a villain. It was one of the reasons he had chosen being an underground hero rather than a daylight hero. It was one of the reasons why Yamada Hisashi had chosen him, of all people, to latch onto. As the blonde had joked after being asked why he chose to become Shuta's best friend, why he chose to become Shuta's boyfriend, why he chose to become Shuta's fiancé, every introvert needs an extrovert and you just happen to be the only introvert I know. Shoyuta knew it was because Hisashi had been bored one day, then found out that Shoyuta was interesting, which is why he stuck around from day one. He hadn't expected to fall in love, but neither had Shoyuta. Aizawa Shoyuta was nothing if not an introvert. So when this kid began speaking in fast-paced sentences, it took everything in him to try to keep up. The only thing he understood was the kid had offered his notebook to the adult, for some reason that Shoyuta hadn't caught, before running away after Shoyuta had accepted it. I'll make sure my quirklessness doesn't infect you. That was a sentence that Shoyuta took a moment to process. That sentence meant too many things all at once. First, he's quirkless. So he has no natural defense against his bullies, like Shoyuta had himself and had assumed the kid had based on how he hadn't seemed too bothered that Kaken had knocked him out and left him. So he probably had some sort of hero crush on Shoyuta, who fought essentially quirkless, particularly against mutation quirks and quirks that were naturally resistant to his own. So, Shoyuta realized this kid, who potentially was a fan of his, he fought a grimace at the idea of someone being his fan, was alone. 20% of the population of the world sounded like a large amount but was abysmally small. Most were even misdiagnosed as quirkless, so the number was only an estimate and hadn't ever been reflected on in the past 20 years. And as far as Shoyuta was aware, there weren't any quirkless people in this town. Children weren't counted when figuring out who was quirkless, since a late bloomer could potentially abruptly realize that they had a quirk at the age of second. He had been told he was a disease. An infectious one at that. Someone had told an 8-year-old child that he wasn't good to have around anyone else. In case the fact that he had been born without a quirk would rub off on someone else, like just that would ruin someone else's chances of having a quirk when they had been born with one. It was like saying someone that was born a male would cause someone that was born female to grow the genitalia, something a lot of transgendered men and women, probably some non-binary pals as well, would be incredibly happy about. Third, the final thing Shoyuta had realized wasn't even related to this sentence. It was the fact that this kid's mother had looked at the time and hadn't given a second thought about why her child wasn't at home. Most 8-year-olds weren't given phones, In fact, Shoyuta would think that this kid definitely didn't have one based on how he had written these notes he had created into a notebook. Most teenagers he had seen would write notes about their hobbies into their phones, and Shoyuta could see this was a hobby and not something formal by random insertions that looked like a diary with "Eraserhead is so cool." He took this villain down in less than a minute with just a scarf. He didn't even use his quirk before the notes that covered his capture scarf. Shoyuta could accept this last one. If perhaps this boy's mother worked a night job? He had always been far too nosy. Hisashi had once fondly told him that he could be mistaken for a cat if he only wore some cat ears, and his patrol was done. He had moved it even earlier so he could attempt to fit in a nap or at least a short rest before he needed to go to school, so he always finished just before midnight and would be back in his 2-bedroom apartment with Hisashi by 1 a.m. So he did what he was used to, letting curiosity kill a cat somewhere as he followed the boy easily once he located him. The mother was home. The kid snuck inside as quietly as he could but was greeted by a woman that was only slightly taller than the boy. She didn't make a single comment about the late time. Shoyuta then wondered, did the boy tell her that he was at that Kaken's place often? Or did she just not care? He sent out a quick text, knowing his workaholic friend would see it since there was no time better than midnight to create crazy theories about old cases, and waited there for half an hour as the two in the house got ready for bed before his phone dinged. Aizawa, has there been any cases of a missing child with green hair, green eyes, and freckles in the past 4 years? False alarms and otherwise. Tsukachi, not that was recorded. Did you find a child of that description? I can send word out to search for their parents? Male or female? Aizawa Shoyuta was nothing if not an introvert. But he also stuck his nose where it didn't belong often and, for the first time, he wasn't sure if he should. When Midoriya Izuku was 10, he had been expelled by his school. When Midoriya Izuku was 10, his mother was jumped by a gang and died by blood loss. When Midoriya Izuku was 10, he found himself in a precinct, surrounded by adults with various quirks that he found himself analyzing the pros and cons of while trying to ignore his reality. When Midoriya Izuku was 10, he was put into Child Protective Services and then put up for adoption. When Midoriya Izuku was almost 11, he met his best friend, even if he didn't know that he had. Hi, Izuku. What's your name? The purple-haired boy looked up from where he had been fiddling with a drink coaster, a surprised expression before the purple eyes glanced around suspiciously. All the other kids were subtly looking over, trying to observe what would happen when the freak met the loser, or blatantly staring as if trying to see if they could use this interaction against either one of them. Izuku knew this. But he hated seeing someone as ostracized as he is, even if he couldn't tell just yet why the other boy was. When a caretaker looked over though, the alarm on the woman's face was almost funny. The glare when the boy opened his mouth was decidedly not, though. The glare didn't relax even after the boy slowly shut his mouth. I'm Shinso Hitoshi. Don't talk to me. This message was very neatly written on a whiteboard. Izuku glanced back at the glaring caretaker. She didn't even notice the bickering happening next to her with how focused she was on intimidating the purple-haired boy into staying silent. Izuku pulled out his notebook, one of the few empty ones he had left, from where he had it kept in his yellow backpack and tried to imitate the neat lines of the other. That's okay, I can write to you instead. Is your name pronounced like Hitoshi or Hidetsuka? The other boy blinked a few times, staring back at Izuku hard like he was trying to figure out a motive, before pointing at the first pronunciation. So, Shinso Hitoshi? That sounds so cool. My messenger, huh? So, is your quirk like telepathy or something? Can you read my thoughts? Izuku bit his tongue, sticking it out slightly, as he tried to make his thoughts as loud as possible. He was probably the loudest there anyways, just based on how quickly his thoughts moved compared to others, but he figured he should try anyways. The other boy looked so confused. It would make sense if people don't like you because of your quirk if it's telepathy. A lot of people don't like others knowing what they think, but you don't have to worry about that with me. Izuku grinned at the other. I often get told I speak my mind too much, so you would know my thoughts even if you aren't reading them. Izuku stopped his word vomit as Shinso carefully wrote out 2 characters. Izuku looked at them, narrowing his eyes as he picked each kanji apart in an attempt to recognize the unfamiliar word. It was made with two kanji he knew, but he had never seen them put together before. Your quirk is washing brains? The other rolled his eyes. Controlling brains. I can make you do whatever I want you to do if I talk with you. There was a resigned look on his face as he went back to playing with the coaster. Izuku thought of what he knew about that type of power, realizing he had never analyzed that type of quirk before, and the closest he had gotten was Eraserhead himself, and his fingers itched to start writing again. That's so cool. The wide purple eyes turned back to Izuku, but he didn't notice. You could do such cool stuff with that, like stop a fight before it even starts. You could get a criminal to confess to a crime they did. You could get someone with a quirk suited to a situation to use their quirk if they refused or didn't know how to do what you needed them to do. There's so many possibilities. You'd be such a cool hero. Izuku slapped a hand over his mouth. Sorry, you already knew that. I should shut up. Sorry. Izuku lasted only a moment before he opened his mouth again. Could I do an analysis on your quirk? I mean, you can totally say no and I can wait until you do become a hero, or just do it whenever I manage to see you use your quirk if that's okay with you instead, but it sounds super cool and I really like analyzing others' quirks, but I've already analyzed everyone here and they aren't as cool as yours is. Oh no, I forgot I was supposed to be writing to you, I'm sorry. When Shinso Hitoshi was 10, he met Izuku and for the first time since he had gained his quirk, smiled. Because someone believed he could become a hero. When Aizawa Shoyuta was 25, he learnt the boy he had become attached to had become an orphan before he managed to file the case to get the boy brought into his and his fiancée's custody. For when Aizawa Shoyuta was 23, he met a boy that gave him a notebook. This notebook contained notes that saved his life on more than one occasion, notes that improved his fighting ability, notes that, unfortunately, carried him up the rankings faster than he ever believed would be possible. Notes that saved more lives than he could count. When Midoriya Izuku turned 11, he met Eraserhead for the second time in his life. Hey kid, it's been a while. His hair was ruffled by the man, as he looked up in absolute shock from where he was writing while sitting next to Toshi. By the annoyed look at the muzzle Toshi had been forced into, Eraserhead was just as annoyed by the treatment of the caretakers as Izuku was. In fact, Eraserhead did something that Izuku didn't have the courage to and began unbuckling the device. Both Izuku and Hitoshi grabbed his arms though. If you do that, Toshi will get a worse punishment. Izuku quietly said this, glancing nervously around the room. He had learnt that the caretakers were not to be trusted by this point. I don't want Hitoshi to be upset again. The man narrowed his eyes, glancing between the door where a long-haired blonde man was speaking with a caretaker and Hitoshi, before sighing and removing his hands. So your name is Hitoshi? Why did they put that on you? Looking down at the whiteboard that had half of a conversation written on it, raising an eyebrow at what looked like half of a study conversation even though neither of the two boys had homework, Shoyuta expected the other to pick it up and either find a blank white spot of the board or to erase the previous conversation, but instead the other boy spoke. They heard Toshi talking with me. He didn't even use his quirk, they're just a bunch of meanies. The freckled boy whined, pulling up a familiar-looking notebook, but this one didn't hold his and his fiancée's hero names and instead had emitter quirks 4 written on the front. It kind of made Shoyuta curious, but he figured he had time to ask about it. Since curious green eyes looked up to him. Why are you here, Mr. Eraserhead? The purple-haired boy's eyes widened, looking at Midoriya in alarm before looking at Shoyuta again in awe. Shoyuta almost couldn't keep the grimace off his face when he realized this new kid, Hitoshi, was probably also a fan of his. Namuri and Hisashi had a field month when he had admitted to meeting Midoriya, since they had been so nosy about the notebook he had been studying. Well, I found out my favorite kid was in one of these hellholes and decided to visit to see if he wanted to come live with me and my fiancé. Shoyuta felt a shot of nervous anxiety after he said this. Glancing back over at Hisashi, who was on his way over to the three in the corner, the blonde's eyes were trained on the muzzle, both fear and anger being hidden by a bright smile. Oh, then why are you over here talking with us? The boy tilted his head to the side before he brightened almost impossibly. Is Hitoshi the one you're talking about? That's so cool. Before Shoyuta could interrupt, glancing at the blonde who had joined them, Before Shoyuta could correct Midoriya's assumption, Hizashi interrupted. Well, we actually came for a Midoriya Izuku, but I have to talk with Shoyuta about something really quick. Please excuse us. The strained smile the blonde gave the erasure hero, before grabbing his arm and dragging him to the side, told Shoyuta everything. Homophobia. Shoyuta ventured a guess, glancing towards the door where the caretaker was still standing with her arms crossed. Not only that, but because we aren't married, we wouldn't be allowed anyways. The blonde huffed a sigh, pushing his hair back. We can fight homophobia and we can get married before the wedding, at least legally for both, but there's another problem, isn't there? Shoyuta had gotten used to the blonde's tells by this point, since they had been together since high school, so he knew the other was holding back from saying something. We both agreed that we would get Izuku out of here. We even began setting up the spare room for him. Shoyuta waited for the other to continue, but when he didn't and instead looked away, he followed the blonde's gaze. But you want to help his friend, right? We would need another room, which means moving, and I know how much you like the apartment and dash. Shoyuta stopped his fiancée from talking himself into a panic over his desires. I wanted to talk with you about it too. I would love to help Hitoshi out of this place, kitten. Shoyuta let out a small smile, pulling the hand out of his fiancée's hair. It's an unexpected development, for sure. I know you don't like when things aren't in the plan, but it's okay to want this. He pulled the blonde with him back to the kids, one looking severely confused and the other now more calm now that he's gotten used to the sight of his Sai hero. All right, Midoriya and dash. Izuku. The sad expression on the boy's face convinced Shoyuta to not question it. Then, Izuku and Hitoshi, I want you two to be aware of where my fiancé and I are at currently. Taking a seat on the ground in front of the two boys, it only took a moment of anxious contemplation before Hizashi decided to join Shoyuta rather than choosing a chair instead. We would love to adopt the both of you. Unfortunately, to do so we need to hurry up our marriage process and get a house so you can each have your own room, so it'll be a few months before we can do that. If, at any point, you would rather we didn't adopt you, we will respect your wishes, but we would love to have you both in our family. But, our quirks? Shoyuta raised an eyebrow at that. I'm aware that you are supposedly quirkless, even though I sincerely doubt that just based on the notebook you gave to me a few years ago and, in fact, would like to have someone check on that diagnosis, and Hitoshi has a quirk that society has deemed dangerous just based on the torture device on him. However, both myself and Hizashi were deemed dangerous when we were your age. I wore one of those myself when I was young. Hizashi was uncharacteristically quiet as he admitted to this. What? Mr. Eraserhead and Mr. Present Mike were dash. Izuku's eyes were wide at that admission, even as Shoyuta and Hizashi were surprised by the boy recognizing the blonde outside of costume. Yes, it's an unfortunate truth of our society. We do our best to fight the prejudice and prove them wrong, but Hizashi huffed, crossing his arms to pout. Anyways, Izuku-kun, Izuku looked surprised at the nickname. How'd you know I'm Present Mike? I read those pages you did on me, but none of them mention my first name. Well, you work with Mr. Eraserhead a bunch, so... Izuku shrugged even as he shrunk into himself. I just kinda remembered a picture I saw after a villain fight where your glasses were knocked off when I saw you come in. It was more a guess than that I knew. Shoyuta could tell there were a few other things the other had probably noticed, just from how uncomfortable the boy was, before Izuku's head shot up. Wait, were you trying to keep it secret? I'm so sorry. I keep being told to not say what I see, but I didn't realize you were undercover or anything, and I really wouldn't have said your hero name if I knew I wasn't supposed to, but I didn't know your last name, 'cause Mr. Eraserhead just said your first name and I didn't want to be rude and say that name without your permission, but dash. Shuda's head spun, unable to keep up with the verbal vomit happening in front of him, and Hizashi, thank every deity imaginable, noticed how overwhelmed Shoyuta was. Oh no, don't worry about that, Izuku-kun. I'm very happy that you recognized me. I was just curious what gave me away, since no one really ever does. The bright smile directed towards the kid calmed whatever anxiety attack Izuku was having, but Shoyuta glanced to the other boy who seemed just as overwhelmed as Shoyuta was, though it was certainly not due to Izuku's rant. Hitoshi, would you like to join the conversation? Surprised at being addressed, The boy jumped and glanced between the two heroes in awe. He hesitantly nodded, but flinched back when Hizashi reached for the muzzle. Shoyuta quietly said that they needed to get a caretaker to remove it, gold eyes narrowing at the device at this information before huffing again and pushing himself up to stomp towards the glaring woman. "Do you know any sign language, Hitoshi?" "A little," Hitoshi gestured, shrugging as he apparently tried to stay composed and not give in to his hero worship. "Toshi and I have tried learning from the library, but it's really difficult." Izuku complained, though Shoyuta had a slight suspicion that the boy was whining on Hitoshi's behalf rather than his own. "That's fine, learning other languages can be hard, but it's admirable that you tried to teach yourself as it is. Hizashi and I have been taking classes for a couple years now, so we could probably teach you if you wanted." Shoyuta hesitated before continuing to speak, figuring he might as well get it over with. "Since you are the two we want to adopt, you should know how the next few years will look with us. Hizashi's quirk is sound-based, as I'm sure you're aware, which means the backlash of using his power is damage to his ears. The quirk specialist we went to stated that he will most likely be fully deaf in 10 years. Izuku's eyes lit up in a strange way before looking down, flickering in a way that Shoyuta had only seen once from someone that had been diagnosed with nystagmus, and Shoyuta decided to not ask about it. If Izuku wanted to tell him and Hizashi, he would. "Try to adopt these children, and how will I know if we will be a good fit if you won't let him talk with us?" Hizashi's voice was increasing in volume, and Shoyuta didn't need to hear more than that to know what was going on. He sighed, sadly looking at Hitoshi before ruffling both boys' hair. "Looks like that's our cue to leave. We'll be working on getting the house set up for you too. If at any point you decide that you would rather we didn't adopt you too, just tell us. We won't force you to do anything you don't want to." He pushed himself up, already feeling old just because of that action alone, before looking back down at the two still sitting and looking up at him. "Thank you, Izuku, for your notebook. After I read that notebook, I improved by a lot. There were so many people that I was able to save that I know I wouldn't have been able to do anything for before I read your book. You saved so many people by just giving me that notebook." He let out one of his rare smiles towards the shocked freckled boy. "Thank you, on behalf of myself and all those I saved with your advice." When Midoriya Izuku turned 11, he received the best birthday gift he could possibly imagine, his hero thanking him and telling him that something that Izuku had done had resulted in people being saved. He wasn't the useless Deku that Kaken had called him if he had helped people, right? It took a few months for the two pro-heroes to find a house with 3 bedrooms and plenty of space for a 4-person family, but they never let the 2 boys they were going to adopt think they had abandoned them. If not both the heroes, at least one would visit every week on the same day and talk with the 2 11-year-olds for anywhere between 10 minutes and 2 hours. Hitoshi was careful to avoid speaking again in these few months. He didn't want his idol to see him in the muzzle again, but he participated with his written words and a few signs. His sign language repertoire had increased some as well, since Present Mike would coach him on the gestures whenever that became his chosen form of communication. Izuku did his best to avoid falling into a rant around the 2 men, not wanting to repel them and take away Toshi's chance to get away from the muzzle and to people who didn't seem to mind his quirk. He didn't believe Eraserhead when the man said that he probably had a quirk and didn't put much stock into the idea of getting his quirk checked once more, so he didn't see any reason to adopt a quirkless loser like him. Hitoshi was so much cooler than Izuku, so Izuku wouldn't be surprised if they decided later that they only wanted Hitoshi. He wouldn't be able to hold it against them either. Even if Izuku had helped people because he had started writing out what he sees, he didn't see this as a good enough reason to adopt Izuku. Izuku was just going to annoy them. But he was going to get Hitoshi adopted first. The 2 men spent months searching for a good house, all the while going through the ridiculous paper process of getting married, and once they found it they could only feel an intense relief. It held everything they were looking for, except a large kitchen, but they could do without that, and was even nearby to UA. It took half a month to get the paperwork for the ownership transfer to process, then another month for the house to be moved into and decorated, though Shoyuta was pretty sure that trying to get help from their supposed friends had hindered their progress, particularly from Kayama and Fukukado, who were more interested in poking around their stuff than moving it or unpacking it. Finally, the time came for the house inspection. The house was new and the two heroes had purposefully checked that all the appliances were as updated as they could get them, everything from the water heater to the washer and dryer, but despite that, Hisashi was still extremely anxious and almost hovering over the inspector's shoulder. Shoyuta could tell that the inspector was accustomed to new adopting parents hovering, however, so he didn't bother with getting the blonde to sit and wait. Well, aside from one small thing, I don't see any issues with you adopting these two boys. The inspector finished the checklist after a few hours of anxious waiting, and Hisashi almost relaxed. Almost. What is the, small thing? You're both pro heroes, correct? Can you run me through a normal weekly schedule with you two? Shoyuta could guess where this was headed, so he took over for the confused blonde. I work as an underground hero, so I'll typically patrol a few neighborhoods from 1800 until around midnight if I don't have a big mission. Hisashi is a daylight hero, but because he works as a teacher at UA, the same as myself, he doesn't patrol. From 0800 to 1600 we are at the school, but we can leave earlier since our last classes are at, so there will always, at least, be one of the two of us, not to mention the multiple pro heroes we are friends with if for some reason we get dragged into a mission for the boys to turn to. Shoyuta yawned at the end of this explanation. It's up to the two of them if they want to be homeschooled or go to public school. We could also afford a private school if that's what they chose, and if they choose to homeschool, we have been given permission to bring them to UA whenever we want or need to. Sometimes Shoyuta wondered what was going through Nizu's head. Other times, he wanted nothing more than to look the other way. Any other questions? Nope. Looks like you're good to go, Mr. and Mr. Aizawa. Shoyuta could see the stars in Hisashi's eyes upon hearing their new last name, even if it was just their last names hyphenated, and couldn't deny the warm feeling he felt himself. We will contact you within the next week, once the paperwork is processed, to inform you of the process completion. The inspector gave the two a warm smile. Congratulations on becoming new parents. You can go fill out the guardianship paperwork at any moment after we call you. After receiving the inspector's business card, which also held the phone number they should expect a call from, and seeing her off, Shoyuta watched as his husband, that had such a nice ring to it, his husband physically vibrated and activated his quirk to save the windows of this new house, making a mental note to get some quirk-proof glass installed. Yeah. Even with his quirk erased, the blonde was still shockingly loud. We're parents, Shoyuta. Oh, we need to let Deku and Toshi know. They're gonna be so excited. It's been months. Oh, I hope they still are okay with us adopting them. I'm so happy. The blonde went from bouncing in his excitement to suddenly full-on sobbing in his husband's arms. We're gonna be parents, Shoyuta. We're gonna be parents. Shoyuta soothed his overly emotional husband, rolling his eyes and smiling as he ran his fingers through surprisingly, with how much product he used when in uniform, silky hair as he waited for the emotional train wreck in his arms to calm down. We are. Shoyuta simply said this in response to the blonde, the two words just barely able to convey the joy he felt himself at this development. They had been working towards this goal for months, technically years, ever since Shoyuta met Izuku, really wanting to bring the freckled child out of the neglectful situation, but sometimes, something this big didn't hit someone until it was just about to happen. Like a scientist researching a cure finally getting fruits for all their labor, the couple could finally see the fruits growing in for them to pluck. The next week was spent ordering in the special quirk glass to avoid accidents, adding in final touches that they thought the two boys would appreciate to their rooms, and installing all the electronics they had moved in after the inspector left as the last pieces of furniture. It was as their windows were being installed that they got the call, Shoyuta just barely able to protect the workers from the shattered glass and apologizing for his husband's enthusiasm to the almost audibly stunned worker on the other side since Hisashi didn't have the foresight to move the speaker away from his mouth. They decided to wait until the next morning to pick the boys up, since that was normally the day they visit anyways. Shoyuta even decided to skip patrol that night to attempt to get a decent rest before moving the kids in. I'm sorry, but the boys you requested aren't in this orphanage anymore. The caretaker they had dealt with before lied blatantly to their faces, Izuku and Hitoshi clearly behind her talking through shaky signs and oblivious to the fact the couple was there. Might I suggest another child instead? The fakest smile Shoyuta had ever seen graced her face. Shoyuta didn't even change his expression, merely walking past her and to the two boys instead. "Hey kids, how are you doing today?" Hitoshi signed a quick okay, a smile threatening to break through the stoic expression the boy wore, while Izuku freely grinned up at Shoyuta. "We're doing great. Hitoshi is getting better at his signs, but I'm still struggling a bit, so we decided to try talking in only sign language. I keep forgetting though." Izuku frowned at that, not realizing he had forgotten even as he said he kept forgetting, and Shoyuta stopped a laugh from escaping him. He thought it was cute. Hitoshi seemed to agree with him, by the subtle shaking of his shoulders as he hid his mouth. It had been a surprise, to Shoyuta at least, to learn that Izuku was actually having issues learning sign language. According to him, it's easy to learn it but much more difficult to do it. It was the difference between watching a skilled dancer demonstrate a few highly advanced steps and trying to mimic those steps as an absolute beginner. He knew the theory, could translate what was said to him with no issue or mistranslation, but fumbled his hands when trying to communicate himself. "Well, I have some good news to share with you too." Shoyuta could hear Hizashi arguing with the caretaker again, and could only sigh at his husband. It wasn't like this caretaker was in charge of the orphanage. "But first, I want to ask one more time. Do dash. Yes, we want to be adopted by you." Izuku interrupted him, grinning as he correctly guessed the question Shoyuta was going to ask just based on how they were asked at least once a month. The first few times, they hadn't been able to give an answer because were they allowed to want this? Hitoshi nodded when Shoyuta looked over at him, signing out "I want" before looking at Shoyuta expectantly. Normally, after Shoyuta asked, he would give a smile and ruffle their hair. It had quickly become his favorite activity, but this time Shoyuta kept a serious expression. "Are you absolutely certain?" Izuku tilted his head, confused. Eraserhead didn't usually ask if they were certain. "I'm absolutely certain. I don't have any reason to complain, though I don't think you actually want me and just have convinced yourselves that you do. You'll change your mind when you get closer to being able to adopt us. Just, please, take Toshi with you when you do." And Toshi is excited about it, even if he doesn't look it. Hitoshi flushed when Izuku called him out on it, shyly looking back at Shoyuta. "But what's up?" Izuku swung his legs back and forth as he asked the adult, tilting his head slightly. Shoyuta took a deep breath in, before carefully saying his next words. "All our paperwork is signed and ready to go except for one last packet each. The house we found is ready for you two to move in today. The only thing we need to get is clothing for you two and to sign those packets." Izuku stared back, not comprehending what he had just been told despite how fast his thoughts analyzed each word separately, while Hitoshi widened his eyes, a wide grin pushing its way to the surface. "We're going to adopt you both today and we can bring you home at any time you like." Izuku blinked a few times. "You adopting me?" Shoyuta frowned at the question, uncertain on what that meant. "Did you not want us to? You just said that you were dash." No, that's not what I meant. I just..." Izuku searched for a better way to say it but gave up. "I didn't think you meant it. I mean, I know you want Toshi 'cause he's just so cool, how could you not, but I'm lame, I'm just a quirkless nobody, why would you want me? Why would anyone?" "Izuku," Shoyuta sighed. "What would get this kid to believe him? I've wanted to adopt you since the day I met you. You don't know this but I followed you home, just to make sure you got there safely, the day we met. When I saw your mother not comment on the fact that it was after midnight, I just..." Hizashi likes to say my maternal instincts awoke, making me a mama bear, mama cat, or whatever. "I looked into your mother and various other people around you, noticing the ridiculous amount of neglect you were suffering, and I was preparing to file a case to get you transferred into my custody. The day I found out you were in the system, I was equal parts upset and relieved. Upset because you had no choice given to you, as I was going to offer you that choice and not just file it without your consent. Relieved because it meant I could adopt you. I had spent that year and a half compiling all the information I could. Hizashi had already cleaned out and set up the spare room for you before we came here that first day." Shoyuta glanced over at the two arguing, still in the doorway. Hizashi seemed as though he were just too happy to get truly angry, so Shoyuta wasn't worried about accidental quirk usage. He leaned towards the two, saying in a stage whisper, "And between the three of us, once we finish filling in the paperwork that gives us legal custody of you two, we are going to sick the police on this place." The muzzle they used on Hitoshi is a form of abuse and is illegal to use on anyone under the age of 16 anymore. "We didn't do anything yet because we didn't want you two taken away to somewhere else, if you were still amenable to letting us adopt you." Shoyuta straightened out, raising an eyebrow at the stunned child. "Now, Izuku, do you want us, Hisashi and I, to adopt you?" Izuku's eyes filled with tears, smiling as he said, "Yes, I want you to adopt me." The mansion present Mike, "No, wait," he said to go ahead and call him Hisashi. He also said that his name could be shortened to Zashi, like Toshi's name. The mansion that Zashi, that sounded weird to Izuku but he couldn't pinpoint why, pulled the ugly neon green car up to was definitely not what Izuku, or for that matter, Hitoshi, was expecting. He knew that hero pay was nothing to laugh at, but a mansion in Mizudafu? There's no way. They were probably just dropping by to introduce the two kids to a richer friend or something. Nobody greeted them as Hisashi and Era. Shoyuta led the two into the house, then looked at them as though expecting something from them. Izuku stared back, not sure what they were waiting for, and Hitoshi shifted behind Izuku. They hadn't spoken since they left the orphanage, aside from Shoyuta calling someone he called Tsukachi and telling that person, "We've got them now, so launch the attack." Izuku would hear in a week that the orphanage was shut down and Shoyuta would merely shrug and say, "Wonder what happened," with a malicious-looking grin. "Well, any thoughts so far?" Hisashi couldn't sit silently for much longer, bouncing a bit in his anxiousness. Izuku wasn't sure what he was supposed to think about it. About what? The mansion or the car or dash? The mansion, though that term is a bit outdated by now. Might as well just call it a house. Shoyuta shrugged, putting a hand on Hisashi's shoulder to attempt to physically calm the jumping. It didn't work, but Izuku had to give him props for trying. Though, it would be nice if you called it home instead. The blonde hero gave an attempt at a grin, even though he was clearly too nervous to give that expression. "We live here." Hitoshi spoke for the first time in months, very carefully keeping the question out of his tone, and Hisashi winced. He quickly spoke afterwards, though, so Hitoshi didn't have enough time to think it was about his quirk. Or so the voice hero thought. "Is it not what you expected?" "Sorry, Shoyuta didn't like the first place I liked dash. It was across the street from a convenience store." Shoyuta said this as though that konbini in particular had offended Shoyuta. Or the second dash. "I was not going to live next to that chatty pair of grandmas." It was torture to spend 2 hours listening to them talk about everything they could think of dash. Izuku winced at that, making a note, "Don't rant to Shoyuta, he might get annoyed." And that was before we were even near the address. "Oh please, you like talking about their cats?" Hisashi rolled his eyes at his husband. "You didn't like any of the ones I did for one reason or another until we finally found this place, and the only reason you agreed to it is because it's a quiet neighborhood near UA. It's only logical to want to live near the place we work while being in a safe neighborhood." Shoyuta crossed his arms and Izuku almost wanted to say the man was pouting, but that was weird to think. Eraserhead pouting? He pushed the thought away, peeking around what he could see from the entrance. The first floor was rather bright, in Izuku's opinion. There were plenty of darker colors to show Shuta's preference through the decor, but the white walls and open floor plan made the sunlight that leaked in more than enough to see with. Not far from the front door was rather fancy, in Izuku's opinion, but he only had Kaken's and his own previous house to compare it with. Set of stairs with a rail on the right, the stairs leading to a small landing before more stairs led up and to the right. The front room looked rather lived in, if only because the mess of brightly colored blankets mixed with muted colored ones on the couch. Izuku could just barely see a surprisingly modest kitchen behind what looked like a breakfast bar, but was already acting as a catch-all counter for the two heroes. The kitchen looked out of place in the mansion, with the modern black and white design, though was no less fancy in Izuku's opinion. "Your rooms are up the stairs." Hisashi turned his attention back to the two who were just letting their eyes roam around what they could see so far. "We went ahead and tried to decorate the rooms how we thought you might like, but feel free to change it up if you like. Express yourself." Your bedrooms are your space and we promise to only enter into your rooms if we either get your permission or think you're in danger. Right, Shoyuta? Milkshake has taken a liking to Izuku's room, but if you don't want to have her in there you can just close the door to her. Or trade with Hitoshi. Izuku turned with a questioning look towards Shoyuta. He shrugged. Milkshake is our calico. A cat. Izuku was more of a dog person, but cats were cute too. Hitoshi loved cats though, so maybe he should trade rooms just for that. Izuku just wanted Hitoshi to be happy. But your rooms are upstairs along with the guest bedroom and a gaming room that Nimue, you'll know her as Midnight, the R-rated hero? Does that mean he would have a chance to question her quirk? She seemed to think you two would appreciate the gaming room. Nimue set it up herself and wanted us to film your reaction to it. It's fine if we don't do that though, she just is worried that you won't like it. Hizashi took a moment to think. Oh, you can't see the door from here, but on the opposite wall from the kitchen is the door to the master bedroom, where Shoyuta and I sleep. If you need anything, and I don't care if you think it's a bother, I mean anything, and we're in there, you're welcome to come in and ask. Hizashi looked at them sternly, making sure they nodded before he grinned again. Well, what are you waiting for? When you're done getting settled in and exploring, we're gonna go shopping to get you some clothes. Izuku noticed as Shoyuta pointed over at what looked like a shoe rac. Take off your shoes before entering was probably what Era Search Shoyuta was saying. He slipped out of his beaten-up high tops, careful to set them on the rack, before inching towards the stairs slowly as he heard Hitoshi do the same. Izuku was cautious as he walked forward, almost certain that he would mess everything up just by being there, and he only became more nervous as Shuta's eyes seemed to tighten. But Shoyuta didn't say anything, turning to go curl up in the nest of blankets on the couch. They're scared to walk into the house. Shoyuta made this observation to Hizashi after the boys went upstairs and out of sight, the smile dropping off of the blonde's face as a sad expression took over. Well, we expected that, right? Hizashi cuddled up to Shoyuta on the couch, taking comfort in how his husband began petting his hair like he did their cat. Doesn't make it any easier to see, Shoyuta sighed. Hizashi couldn't help but agree. The hall at the top of the stairs didn't look too out of the ordinary, so Izuku peeked in through the first doorway he found. It was a bathroom, probably meant to be shared among all those that were roomed on the top floor, but Izuku decided to skip that room for now. He shuffled to the next door, feeling Hitoshi's hand holding the bottom of his shirt pull a little as he probably looked into the bathroom for a moment before catching up. The next door was a quiet-looking room, surprising Izuku a bit. With Hizashi most likely being in charge of the decorations, Izuku had expected all of the bedrooms to practically scream at him since neither the first floor or hallway did that. Stepping in, he looked around to see if he could find a hint on whose bedroom this was supposed to be. The cat that was laying on the desk gave it away, though Izuku was almost scared of the glare she sent him. She didn't seem to deserve a sweet-sounding name like Milkshake with how angry she looked. The bed was fitted with a black comforter and a forest green sheet set, the headboard held a lamp and alarm clock, and the bedside table had his stack of notebooks. Izuku could almost swear that there were more than the number he was used to. There was a black desk, where Milkshake had chosen to perch for what seemed to be an interrupted nap, and Izuku was almost in absolute awe over how large the desk was. There were shelves everywhere. There was an empty cubby hole of sorts in the middle of the desk that looked to be the perfect size for a computer monitor, plus a shelf below the desk where Izuku supposed a computer would fit, but the desk was fully empty aside from Milkshake and some spare office supplies. There was a set of dresser drawers, but Izuku didn't know why he'd need such a large dresser. He only had a few changes of silo. Oh wait, Hizashi said they'd be going shopping. There were knickknacks here and there along with a few picture frames both hung up on the wall and placed in the many shelves of Izuku's desk. Izuku was surprised when he saw what looked to be a crocheted plush of Eraserhead, complete with crocheted goggles and scarf, sitting on one of the shelves. Izuku had only taken a few seconds to observe the entirety of the room before his eyes landed back on the glaring Milkshake. Izuku inched forward, figuring he should greet the final member of the family he hadn't met yet, but froze when she started growling. She didn't want him there. That's fine, he needed to bring Hitoshi to see his own room. It was the room directly across the hall from his, this one with a purple theme rather than a green one. The desk Hitoshi had was a white one, to contrast his black desk, and had more space than it had shelves. But otherwise, looked similar enough to his own room, down to even the crocheted eraser head plushie. "This is mine." Hitoshi didn't hide the question this time, whispering it to Izuku. This room is all yours and you can do whatever you want with it." Izuku looked back at Hitoshi with a grin, turning to grab his hands. He paused. "That seems like something Hisashi would say, right?" Izuku pulled Hitoshi over to the bed without waiting for an answer. The room they were in was huge and the bed was almost as ridiculous in size, Izuku realized as they stepped up to it. "It's so big." Izuku put a hand on top of the bed, pushing down then giggling. "It's so soft, Toshi. Feel it." Hitoshi mimicked Izuku's actions, smiling a little at the feeling of his hands sinking into the material. Izuku's smile grew when he saw that Hitoshi was happy. It didn't matter if they kicked him out after this, as long as Hitoshi stayed happy like this. "Zuzu." Hitoshi looked into Izuku's eyes, wondering what he was thinking. "Ah, that's right, we need to go let them know we checked out the top floor. I'm super excited to get some new clothes." Izuku regretted saying that as the pair of heroes brought them into a high-end store, especially when he saw the price tag of a pair of ripped jeans, they weren't even full pants. Why were they so expensive? "I'm okay, I don't need any clothes really." But somehow Hisashi managed to force him into the changing rooms with what felt like 5 years' worth of outfits. It was exactly a month and a half if he wore something new every day without repeats, his mind having restlessly done the math before he ended up with the pile of clothing. Hitoshi seemed to think the impromptu fashion show with one model was funny up until the point that he became the new model once the first one collapsed next to Shoyuta, who was sitting on his phone. "I don't know why we can't just wear a graphic tee and jeans or something," Izuku grumbled, crossing his arms. He wasn't pouting, he was just trying to make Hisashi know that he was annoyed by being the adult's model. The blonde stared at him, his eyes shifting down to look at Izuku's shirt before looking back up with a pointed raised eyebrow, but Izuku looked down and he didn't think there was anything wrong with his pants shirt. Literally, it said across the chest. Izuku thought it was funny. "Honey, sweetheart, dear child of mine, sweet Izukuin," Hisashi cooed out, a pitying smile on his face. "The reason I brought you here is precisely because you don't see anything wrong with that t-shirt. Not only does it look bad to have panties written on your shirt," Hisashi ignored the flushed protests of how it says pants not panties, "but it's an actual fashion crime to wear a shirt like that and ill-fitted jeans. Not to mention those sneakers, they need replacing." Izuku looked over at Shoyuta for help, but he was useless as he shrugged and didn't waver his attention from his phone. Izuku had no clue what he was doing on the electronic, but it didn't matter because his hero, Eraserhead, hadn't helped him when he needed it and he now felt betrayed. It was past dinner by the time the blonde finally felt satisfied by their wardrobe's updates and both boys couldn't help but think the blonde was surprisingly fashion-forward considering how bad his hero uniform looked. Didn't make them like the trip anymore, though. Actually, probably made the trip 100 times worse. "All right boys, any requests for dinner?" "Fair warning, both Sho and I are terrible cooks dash." "Speak for yourself," Shoyuta grumbled. "Making cereal does not mean you're a good cook, it means you have the capabilities of a child to put cereal and milk into a bowl." Hisashi took the interruption as though he had said this 1,000,000 times and was ready to say it 1,000,000 more, not once losing his grin. "We can't cook to save our lives, so we always go out for food." The day out had both exhausted Izuku and Hitoshi as well as made them more comfortable to talk with the men, Izuku managing more coherent conversation and Hitoshi managing to say more words than just yes or no. However, one day did not erase years of being told not to talk. So both boys just kind of looked at each other before looking at the adults, unsure what to say in response to the question. Not only was the blonde hero asking for them to name a restaurant, but he was also asking them to voice their desires and, frankly, they hadn't been allowed to have desires around anyone. Izuku only just barely managed to speak up his desires when it was him and his mom, but, "Stop, don't think about it, it won't change anything if you do think about it." Shoyuta noticed their steadfast silence and how they genuinely looked lost, so he stepped forward. "There's a ramen place nearby, we can go there." The blonde shot him a thankful look. Alright then, listeners, time to head on out and get some ramen. Their lives went on like this. The two pro-heroes do everything they can to make the two children more comfortable. The two children try everything they can to think of the pros as their parents. No matter what the result is, Hisashi started carefully, hugging the nervous boy tightly. I promise we will never leave you. Shoyuta rubbed the boy's back, showing without his words that he was there for the boy. Hitoshi was looking around curiously, having never been in a quirk doctor's office before since his quirk had always been obvious and he hadn't been allowed to use it enough for it to cause any injuries, but firmly held Izuku's hand. Even if you do happen to be quirkless, I don't believe you are losing out on anything. Shoyuta wasn't entirely certain what he should say to comfort the boy but made the decision to try anyways. If you're quirkless, that just makes your intelligence even more impressive. We're only doing this to find out about anything we should watch out for, in case you have a quirk that has negative side effects. Not because we want or need you to have a quirk, Izuku. Teary green eyes peeked out from the blonde's hug, meeting slightly red eyes. We will not leave, neglect, or abuse you in any way. We love you no matter what. Izuku's eyes widened almost impossibly at the admission, immediately looking up at Hisashi. The blonde grinned, meeting both green eyes and purple eyes, which had snapped immediately over at the two adults in shock from where the boy was reading a poster about quirk safety, before letting the grin soften some. We love both of you. I, personally, fell in love with you when I first saw you both. Dramatically sighing with his hand held to his chest, even as he didn't let Izuku out of his hug. There you two were, my adorable princes, just awaiting the arrival of your knights to save you. I couldn't wait to become your knight in shining armor. Izuku giggled at the analogy, imagining Hisashi in silver armor and Shoyuta in black armor. Hitoshi hid the small smile he had with the sleeve of his jacket. Midoriya Izuku? Said boy tensed up, avoiding looking over at the nurse that had called for him. The blonde looked at him, smiling comfortingly. We'll be with you the whole time, Hisashi promised. We won't go anywhere. Izuku nodded, letting go. Nizu told me that the answer to this equation Izuku was talking Hitoshi through the homework Nizu had given the two homeschooled kids, the mouse-bear-dog principal taking over their schooling almost immediately after meeting them and being endeared by the little humans. Shoyuta and Hisashi were still confused about whether this was a good or a bad thing. On one hand, Nizu was the most intelligent being they knew about and would therefore challenge the boys while still teaching them what they needed to know. On the other, it was Nizu, an evil mastermind that could easily take over the world. And the square root of this equals X, right, Dad? Hitoshi blinked at Izuku in surprise. It took both pros a moment to realize what was said, Hisashi's eyes tearing up while Shoyuta hid his smile behind a coffee cup. Of course, sweetheart. You're doing so well. Hisashi was the one who answered, his hands coming up to cover his mouth before his excitement came out in a quirk-enforced yell. He was talking to me. Shoyuta immediately argued, scowling towards the blonde. Izuku blinked, a blush coming over his face as he finally realized what he had said. It's illogical to think you would be called Dad. If anything, you should be Papa. This is easy enough to figure out. Izuku, who were you talking to? Freckled cheeks were quickly being hidden behind a bright flush, wide green eyes staring back at the curious adults. Hitoshi saved him. Aizu. Talking to Sho. Hitoshi had taken to calling Shoyuta, Sho, and Hisashi, Zashi, in an attempt to talk even a single syllable less. He was doing better, could join conversations without prompting and asking the occasional question, but there were days where he would go entirely nonverbal. Zashi is Papa. Hitoshi agreed with Shuta's assessment, causing the erasure hero to smirk victoriously over at his pouting husband. Until he realized that meant Hitoshi had just called him Papa, causing his expression to melt into a look that said, my heart was taken by my kids, my husband doesn't get a single piece of it. Hitoshi was crying in a corner when Shoyuta entered the boy's room to check on him, bringing the man's immediate attention. This was the first time Shoyuta had seen the waterworks from the purple-haired child, and he had been grateful that he hadn't been put into a situation to comfort either child. That was probably the skill he lacked the most. However, Hizashi had been called in for an emergency and Izuku was already asleep in bed, which meant that Shoyuta had to make an attempt unless he wanted to wake the other child. Hey, what's wrong? He tried to copy the soft tone Hizashi used when Izuku was getting frustrated with the homework Niza gave, but it came out almost like a growl. Which was probably for the best, since Hitoshi and Izuku had finally gotten used to Milkshake's love language. Shoyuta had forgotten to inform the two children that the cat growled when she was happy, only realizing when he saw that they gave her a wide berth even a week later. Hitoshi spent a lot of time with Milkshake. Even if someone else was in the same room, the boy gravitated to the cat. Did you have a nightmare? You won't, the boy sniffled, trying valiantly to push his tears down. You won't muzzle me, right? Shoyuta felt hurt at that, but tried to see it from the other's point of view. Shoyuta knew he wasn't the easiest to read or, honestly, the easiest to deal with. It was possible the boy had been overthinking. Izuku warned them about that. When he had still thought they were going to take him back to the orphanage, they had quickly had a talk about that, assuring the child they weren't ever taking him to any orphanage, and had thought Shoyuta thought he was annoying since he often found himself pausing to make sure he was answering the questions the child asked correctly. Or the boy had a nightmare where everyone he trusted turned against him. Shoyuta has had far too many of those and understood far too well how jarring those nightmares were. He hoped the nightmare didn't send the child back any, since he had started actually speaking full sentences recently. Hizashi had been ecstatic when Toshi had a full conversation without leaving so many words out that it left them guessing what the boy had meant. He didn't completely feel comfortable enough with them to continuously have complete sentences, but he was getting there and both men were so proud of him for it. Shoyuta realized he hadn't answered the question yet once Hitoshi's tears started overflowing again. No, of course I won't. Why would you think that? Did I muzzle you in your nightmare? The hesitant nod caused Shoyuta to relax a little more. Dreams were far easier to help with than overthinking, since they didn't try to convince someone of a lie and instead just played with their fears. Would you like some warm milk? That helps me when I have nightmares. The tears slowed down once more, a surprised expression taking over. You have nightmares, Dad? Shoyuta smiled at the familial title. Hitoshi rarely used the familial titles, as if he were afraid of the pro's reactions to them, but it always warmed Shoyuta to hear them. Hizashi had yet to stop immediately crying when they were used by either boy. Of course, I had one once where Milkshake gained a gigantification quirk and Nizu used her as a mount to chase me. Shoyuta grimaced at the memory of the dream. It wasn't a nightmare he was able to quite understand, but it had definitely caused him to wake in a cold sweat. Hitoshi giggled slightly at the image, as Shoyuta had hoped, and reached out to the hero as he stood up. The two walked down the stairs hand in hand to go to the kitchen. This was just the first of the many nights he spent comforting Hitoshi from his nightmares, though not all of them were shared with Shoyuta. That was okay, so long as he helped his son feel better before he went back to bed. Eventually, that'll be you. Namuri had said this to the boys, teasing them as they made faces at the pity their fathers were showing. Hitoshi had long lost the tie Hizashi had fussily put on him. Izuku's had lost the neat look before the wedding began. Izuku looked disgusted at the idea Namuri had given, but Hitoshi flushed a little, looking back at their fathers as they stuffed cake in each other's face. Hizashi was laughing with icing smeared even into his hair, while Shoyuta had a soft smile, not at all marred by the chunks of white cake stuck to his face. No thanks, romance is annoying. Izuku disagreed with the pro, shaking his head. You've got to do stuff with them and that's just gross. Hitoshi shifted uncomfortably. But who would I marry? Hitoshi scratched his cheek where a pale scar marred the skin, Namuri's smile turning sad. She knew he was thinking that no one would love him because of his quirk. Anyone would be lucky to have you, sweetie. She reached over, running her fingers through Hitoshi's hair. And if anyone hurts you, you tell Auntie Namuri. The R-rated hero had quickly claimed the title after hearing Izuku call Hizashi Papa once, causing Emi to pout at the fact she hadn't done it first. I'll make them regret hurting either one of my precious nephews. I'm sure your Auntie Emi and Uncle Ken would be happy to join me. Ken hadn't been so thrilled at the title but merely accepted it like there wasn't any way that he wouldn't have been called Uncle. Hitoshi looked at Namuri in confused concern. You You do remember that you're a pro hero, right? Doesn't mean I don't know how to hide a body. Nemuri grinned over her champagne glass. You're doing better, but you'll need to be faster for the exam. Shoyuta clicked the timer he held, showing the time had reduced by 3 seconds as Hitoshi worked to catch his breath. Izuku had finished nearly a full 10 seconds before his brother and had already caught his breath, draining a water bottle off to the side. Hizashi looked slightly confused but didn't let it affect his grin of pride. Try to cut off another 5 seconds before the end of this month and we'll start working on your hand-to-hand. Let's move on to the obstacle course now. Shoyuta walked away. Hizashi quick to catch up with his husband. You haven't told them? The blonde whispered to Shoyuta, who merely grinned at the taller man. It's merely a logical ruse. I want them to do their best so they can get the most out of their classes. Shoyuta was proud of his sons, and had never been disappointed by the two of them, but he knew he needed to push them so they were prepared for the hero course that they wanted to get into. If they think they're going to need to take the exam, they'll work hard to fight whatever Nizu throws at the examinees. They know how sadistic the mouse is, so they're preparing for the absolute worst. I love you, but I think you might need to tone it down a bit. Hitoshi is getting frustrated that he's not as fast as Izuku. I'm getting worried that he's going to let it build up. I'll talk to him tonight, Shoyuta promised, holding the blonde's hand. Are we ever going to change our last names? Hitoshi had asked this, poorly timed since Shoyuta had been taking a planned long drink from his coffee cup and started coughing as a result. Dad, are you okay? Hitoshi smacked Shuta's back to help the choking hero. Shoyuta tried to speak even as he coughed some more, just fine. Did you want to change your family name, Toshi? Hizashi leaned out of the master bedroom, a hairbrush sliding through his long hair. The calm smile encouraged Hitoshi to continue. I mean, we've been family for a couple years now, so, Hitoshi shrugged, shifting uncomfortably. I don't have any good memories of my biological family, so it doesn't make sense to keep the name Shinso. I don't know if Aizu will have a different view on his last name since he had loved his mom, even if she wasn't quite the model mother. Hitoshi blushed a little, rubbing the back of his neck as he avoided meeting their eyes. I wouldn't mind being called an Aizawa Yamada. I wouldn't mind you being called an Aizawa Yamada either, Shoyuta agreed with a teasing smile. He knew what his son was saying, but he kind of wanted to actually hear it. But is that something you actually want? Hitoshi turned a slight bit more red, cursing himself for bringing this up after Izuku had left already to talk with Nizu about something he had seen. Yes, I want that. The words were quietly muttered, but that was enough for Shoyuta. We can get the paperwork later today. Shoyuta stated this, setting his coffee cup into the sink to be washed later. I'll ask Izuku if he wants to do that as well before training. Not like I've got anything else to do. If you hadn't expelled your entire class, Shoyuta, you'd have something to do. Hizashi rolled his eyes before he disappeared back into their bedroom to put an inordinate amount of hairspray into his hair. They weren't worth the time, Shoyuta grunted, reaching to grab his capture scarf. Hitoshi grinned a little at the unintentional compliment Shoyuta had given his sons. Congratulations. Nizu had jumped up onto the coffee table, throwing up confetti to fall over the confused teenagers. You know it's neither of our birthdays, right? Izuku was the first to speak, as per the usual, raising his hand. In fact, you're several months early. I know you like being early, but this isn't really dash. Nizu grinned. This isn't for your birthdays but for your acceptance into the hero course. Hizashi was pouting against the wall. He wanted to tell his sons they were accepted unconditionally. Shoyuta sighed, secretly disappointed they hadn't been allowed to say it. They couldn't even see their sons' reactions to being accepted, since they had been placed behind the boys by the demanding and sadistic principal. I don't understand. Hitoshi said this, leaning forward. We didn't take any exams or tests. How are we accepted? You forget who taught you for the past 4 years, Hitoshi-kun. The principal's paw poked the purple-haired teen's forehead. I know that no matter what test I give you to, you'll pass with flying colors. Aizawa-kun also has been the one in charge of the physical portion for the past 2.5 years, so we know you'd be physically fit enough to compare with the other teenagers. I don't need to have you fight some silly robots to know you'd be just right for the hero course. So congratulations on making it into class 1A. Wait. Even if we consider your explanation of why we aren't taking the entrance exam like every other normal student, Izuku was holding his head, probably because of a headache. He had been getting those quite a lot more recently. It was beginning to get worrying. Why in the world are you placing us in Dad's class? Isn't there the possibility of favoritism? Nizu clapped, his proud grin switching from Hitoshi to Izuku. Excellent question, Izuku-kun. There's a very simple explanation for this. Aizawa-kun has already shown that he can remain impartial while Ken-kun won't be able to. Izuku grimaced at the idea of Uncle Sekijiro. He had demanded they call him that after hearing them call Cementos Uncle Ken, hovering over them during something as simple as sparring. Dad pushed them to be better. Uncle Sekijiro worried over even paper cuts for some reason. Plus, even if you were placed in 1B, Aizawa-kun would still be part of your curriculum as he assists Ken-kun in heroics classes. Oh, that's why he still comes to school even though he expelled 1A this year. Hitoshi said this, causing the three adults to gain a warm feeling. They could all remember the time not too long ago that he could only just barely speak out a yes or no, but now he has grown comfortable enough to speak his thoughts out loud. Precisely. Nizu clapped again, grinning warmly at Hitoshi. Honestly, I wouldn't consider it if Yamada-kun were in charge of 1, which is the main reason he doesn't have a homeroom. The blonde complained at this, trying to show how offended he was at the comment. And I just wanted to apologize for not helping when I could. When Izuku opened the classroom's door, knowing Dad would be right behind Hitoshi and him, he found himself staring at the back of a brunette who seemed to be panicking at the perfect 90-degree bow in front of her. Excuse me? Can I get in? Izuku cut in above the girl's protests. Uraraka Ochako. Izuku recalled her file. He had been given the files of all of his classmates as a challenge from Nizu to analyze them and create support gear for them all. Power Loader was supposed to assign the gear to his first years as a challenge for them to turn in for their finals. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. The girl jumped when she heard Izuku speaking, hurrying out of his way. The boy immediately looked at the board to see where the siblings sat and raised an eyebrow. His brother didn't sit next to him? That didn't make sense. It's fine, you should go take a seat soon though since the teacher will be here in a moment. Izuku looked to where he had been assigned, between Kaken and one of the recommendation students, Yaoyorozu. Nope. Izuku wanted to avoid that conversation with the blonde for as long as possible. Instead, he sat on top of the teacher's podium, Hitoshi standing nearby with an eyebrow raise. Dad should have known better, really. Izuku shook his head in disappointment, gesturing at the chart. Hitoshi was having one of his more rare nonverbal days, merely glancing at the chart before understanding dawned and he leaned against the wall, but Izuku could talk more than enough for two people. You would think that over 4 years would be plenty of time to understand, but dash. You are disrespecting the school, teachers, and authorities of this school by sitting on the podium. Get down immediately. The teen that was bowing before was now yelling at Izuku, who had trained himself to not flinch at yelling by now, knowing it was something he needed to get used to for hero work. I don't think I will, actually. I've done far worse in this school than sitting on the podium. Like the time he glued Uncle Ken's hands to the ground for an experiment. That was funny. Until he had been given his punishment, that is. By the flabbergasted look on Ida Tenya's face, the other teen hadn't anticipated Izuku's response. Hey Dad. Izuku waved over Ida's shoulder at the yellow caterpillar entering the door. Papa wanted you to remember to grab dinner on your way home, but I don't know why he didn't wait until later to tell you. Dad gave Izuku a dry look, clearly not expecting either boy to reveal their relationship before the start of the first day. As Izuku grinned. He had plans but he wasn't going to tell Dad that. Hitoshi waved and Dad's small glare softened, the tiniest of nods to the tallest of his sons. Dad sighed, unzipping his sleeping bag since his lesson on situational awareness was ruined by his son. What are you doing up there, Izuku? Really? You don't see anything wrong with the seating chart? Nothing at all? Shoyuta glanced at the board before shrugging. He saw what the boy was complaining about but he had already stated he wouldn't do any sort of favoritism. Of course, he wasn't prepared for his son's solution. The boy huffed in irritation, then raised his eyebrows at Hitoshi. "You're me." The taller boy hesitated before pointing to himself, giving Kaken a wary look. Izuku jumped off the podium, taking Hitoshi's hand as they walked to the seat between the redhead, Kirishima Aijuru. That's odd. Izuku remembers the boy had black hair in the profile photo, and the blonde, Kaminari Denki. Shoyuta watched the two, raising an eyebrow, before sighing as Izuku sat in Hitoshi's lap with a pout. To be honest, he should have expected it. The boys hated being apart from each other for too long. The only way they could be was in the house, or if one of them was with Nizu. Shoyuta still didn't know how Nizu managed to convince them to separate, but he suddenly wished he did for once. He would need to revise the seating chart for tomorrow, but that was for the future and maybe more awake Aizawa Yamada Shoyuta. Izuku didn't hear Dad's instructions. All of his instincts were telling him, screaming at him to run from the outright murderous glare Bakugo Katsuki was giving him, but he was fighting just to stay standing where he was. Hitoshi moved to stand between his brother and the blonde, using his body to block the stare down Izuku was experiencing, and signed discreetly to him. "You okay?" Izuku nodded, his hands feeling a little too shaky to attempt to sign back. "I don't like him." Izuku snorted. "You're just biased." Izuku tried his best to calm his shaking. "He's not that bad, he just doesn't know how to use emotions other than anger and frustration. His mom isn't the nicest and adults taught him wrong." Izuku left it at that, figuring he had done enough to defend his childhood friend at that point. He knew his experiences with Kaken had been traumatizing, to say the least, but now that he was older he could recognize that his childhood friend's attitude was a failure on the part of the adults in his life. The boy's attention was brought back to where Dad was as Bakugo walked to the circle and received the ball Dad had been holding. The blonde stood in the middle of the circle, glancing from the ball to Dad, before grinning. Izuku could practically hear the other boy thinking, "This is my chance to prove my quirk is better than all these extras." "Die!" Izuku snickered, startled by his childhood friend's scream but really not surprised. It was just like Kaken to yell something like that at a ball of all things. Dad turned the device he was holding to show the distance the ball had traveled with the quirk-enforced throw. His commentary was cut short when several students started muttering at how fun this was going to be. The two boys fought a grimace, knowing exactly how much their dad hated hearing the word fun when attributed to anything to do with training. He took it as a personal challenge to up the difficulty for his sons when Izuku had mistakenly commented that the obstacle course he had them run every training was fun. Hitoshi had been given several rounds of sparring more, with a few other teachers that Dad had managed to drag in. After saying it was fun to spar with their dad, he didn't make that mistake again. His muscles had been aching for a week and Uncle Ken looked guiltily at him every time they crossed paths, which almost made the whole thing 1,000 times worse. Izuku now used the word fun if he wanted the difficulty increased, and had learned to use it like a setting in a video game. Saying the word fun would change Dad from normal difficulty to expert you'll probably die mode. Fun. The two boys winced, inching their way out of the group. They didn't know what Dad was planning for them to do, only that they were going to use quirks on physical tasks, and both boys knew that wasn't going to help them any, but they wanted to make sure Dad knew they didn't have anything to do with how the group was viewing the exercise. By the flash of amusement that went through Dad's eyes, he noticed. They both relaxed when Dad specified that the two of them would sit out since he knew their scores. That had caused a couple students to complain about fairness since he had just threatened to expel them, but none of the three gave the commentary any reaction. Nizu had already agreed that favoritism was impossible to avoid since they had entered the hero course without taking the entrance exam to begin with. Dad was the only one who thought he could avoid it. And X factors into this part of the device to create dash. Izuku took the chance during lunch break to explain how the device he was making for Hitoshi would work. The majority of the students of 1A were sitting nearby, hesitant to interact with their teacher's children, when one particularly explosive blonde stomped up to their table. "Hey nerd!" Izuku looked up at Bakugo. He could remember every time the blonde had beaten him to unconsciousness for being quirkless, every insult he gave Izuku, and every time he had been told by others to not complain. But he chose to greet Bakugo with a grin, rather than any real emotion. "What can I do for you, Bakugo-san?" The blonde frowned after hearing his name, glaring back into green eyes. "Who are you?" "Oh, I'm Aizawa Yamada Izuku. You can just call me Izuku since Hitoshi and I are in the same class along with both of our dads being our teachers. Izuku held out his hand for a handshake. Bakugo looked at the petite hand in front of him, clearly considering something, when Izuku tagged on, or you can call me what you did when we were kids, I guess, but it wouldn't be accurate anymore. So you are Deku? I suppose? Izuku pulled his hand back, going back to the diagram of the voice changer he was creating for Hitoshi. I haven't really been Deku since the last time we interacted. You were the only person who really knew me as Deku, even if others called me the same name. A mistake in the formula. This would create an explosion. Izuku erased the mistake, quickly fixing it. How did the mistake get there? Nizuku. The mouse tended to alter the formulas to Izuku's notebooks or change a word here or there to train Izuku. It was annoying sometimes, but he hadn't yet been able to stop Nizu. Not? Hitoshi spoke up for the first time of the day, forcing the words out. Not Deku. Aizu. Izuku could see that he had exhausted his social speaking for the day, smiling at his taller brother for defending him. Whatever, I bags. Bakugo scoffed, barely even glancing at Hitoshi. I only need to say one thing, I'm sorry. The blonde clearly struggled to say the last word, crossing his arms and glaring at a wall rather than looking at Izuku. Izuku blinked, surprised. What? Bakugo audibly ground his teeth. I'm sorry for how I treated you as a kid. Shortly after Auntie died, the hag had to put me into JSL classes. The lizard decided I needed anger management and therapy for some FNG reason, and the winged beach told me I was treating others wrong. That I was acting like a villain rather than the hero I want to be. Oh, that made more sense. So you're apologizing because your therapist told you to? Izuku crossed his arms on the table, leaning on them. Based on how Bakugo's attitude hadn't changed much from how he was when they were kids, Izuku didn't expect that the therapy was doing much. Then again, he hadn't seen the blonde use his quirk outside of when given permission. As if that beach could make me do anything. The red-eyed glare shifted again, still avoiding meeting Izuku's gaze. She didn't tell me to do shit, nerd. A hand came up to scratch violently at his head, before all the tense anger flooded out of the blonde's body and tired red eyes met curious green. I realized you didn't deserve to be treated that way, that I was a larger a-hole to you than I was to anyone else. You deserve an apology for that sheet at the very least. Izuku hummed, tilting his head to the side. I can't say that I forgive you. Bakugo tensed again, but looked more ready to run away than to fight this time. A large majority of my childhood memories are of you bullying me or recovering from your actions to me. Granny Chio says that a lot of the injuries you inflicted on me will stay with me for the rest of my life. Horror dawned on the blonde's expression, and Izuku couldn't truthfully say he didn't feel a little sadistic satisfaction at that. I flinched away from hugs for a good 2 years after I was adopted, Bakugo. It took several sessions of therapy before I started to believe the adoption was permanent because I didn't believe I was worth anything. The horror was ebbing away into a sad guilt, and Izuku decided that was enough. That expression didn't suit his childhood friend. So no, I can't say I forgive you. However, I am willing to start over. There was a confused hope edging its way into the guilt in Bakugo's expression. So let's try again. Izuku held out his hand, with the same grin he had before. I'm Aizawa Yamada Izuku, but you can call me Izuku, since Hitoshi and I are in the same class, along with both of our dads being teachers here. There was a moment of silence as Bakugo stared at the hand outstretched to him with a blank expression. Izuku leaned forward with a stage whisper. This is where you shake my hand and introduce yourself. Does that All Might? The whispers traveled through the group as they walked into the training ground that Aizawa had pointed out to them, Izuku noting that Nizu had, thankfully, taken Izuku's opinions into consideration. All Might was clearly unqualified to be teaching, regardless of whatever dumb reason he thought he had to be part of a school staff, so assigning him the position of TA was a better option. Of course, that just meant Dad was going to be irritated by the number one, especially since the man had some residual jealousy from the one time Izuku had commented about how All Might was somewhat cool. Izuku still thought it was entertaining how Dad had immediately set out to prove he was better than All Might. Dad glared when All Might opened his mouth, like he was going to talk, before speaking ahead of the blonde. We will be going through a training exercise where you will be allowed to use your quirks to work together to take down a common enemy. There will be 2 teams, one representing the heroes and the other representing villains. The idea is to replicate a raid scenario, so incorporating stealth techniques is encouraged. There will be a 10-minute time limit for the villain team to set up their base. To pass this exercise, you must be able to retrieve the civilians that are being held hostage. At the mention of hostages, Aizawa lifted a poorly stitched doll stuffed with hay. There are 10 civilians in total and it is up to the villain team to place them during the 10-minute setup. With that, Izuku dragged Hitoshi before his classmates. Aizawa Yamada. This is extremely disrespectful. Not only to our teachers, but to the academic setting we are currently in. Ida was sure to continue ranting about Izuku being rude if the green-haired boy didn't interrupt. Sorry, Ida-ten, you're right? Ingenium is quite proud of his genius little brother. Izuku used the word genius loosely, since anyone compared to him and Nizu was an idiot, but you should refrain from making assumptions. I'm merely getting to the assignment as quickly as possible. 9 minutes and 37 seconds, Aizu. Dad's tone showed that Izuku and Hitoshi weren't going to be given any leeway. Well, see ya. With that, Izuku skipped into the facility and got to work as the students behind them murmured in confusion. 22 seconds, Toshi. Izuku panted this out, quickly climbing up a support beam as his purple-haired brother went to the spot Izuku had assigned him. Hitoshi trusted Izuku's plan to succeed, as so many had before this, so didn't question it when Izuku had assigned him into an extremely visible spot that made him feel slightly vulnerable. Even as his classmates filed in cautiously at the end of the countdown, and Dad's eyebrow raised when he saw the position of his son. Bakugo was the first to jump out, when it became obvious that no one else was moving, running straight at Hitoshi and raising a fist. Hitoshi, following Izuku's orders, didn't move a muscle as he casually stood there and watched the blonde's explosive approach. Only for the blonde to suddenly be pulled up in a net that Hitoshi hadn't seen his brother set up, swinging wildly as he cursed at the metal that was unaffected by his quirk. The next to step forward was Kirishima and Siro, hesitant as they looked around for signs of another trap and started inching around the circle that seemed to be surrounding Hitoshi. Hey, what do you call a quirkless astronaut? Their responses of confusion were enough to catch them. Hitoshi felt the snag of his quirk but didn't pull just yet. Just an astronaut, you quirkist assholes. Hiding the fact that it was their responses that caught them by snapping at them as he pulled his control tight, he left them standing where they were. This made the rest of the class hesitate more. The Todoroki boy was the next to approach. Having simply observed as the first 2 attempts failed, Hitoshi watched curiously. He didn't know how Aizu was planning on taking down the rest of the class, but he didn't flinch as he observed Todoroki take a step forward with his right foot and ice began crawling across the floor. Very calmly aware of the fact that Dad wouldn't allow any other students to hurt him or Aizu and the fact that Aizu would rather die before Hitoshi even got a paper cut, he couldn't stop his raised eyebrow as a physical circle appeared around him as the ice crawled around him. Izuku did something to the dirt, was the first thing that Hitoshi thought. But when he resisted the impulse to look up so that he wouldn't out his brother's hiding spot. So far, everything was going according to plan. The chemical he had put into the dirt where Toshi stood was stronger than he expected, but that was good since that meant Toshi was protected. It also worked perfectly to confuse Todoroki, who stopped short at seeing his quirk fail him. That's what you get for relying on it so much. Izuku wasn't cruel. He had specifically told Hitoshi to only defend himself, not attack, but if any student passed a certain point then Toshi was to try to trick them into responding. So if any of the students were able to walk past Hitoshi without making any noise in response, they would pass the exercise. But there were also specific ways Izuku had planned to trap anyone that overly relied on their quirk. Katsuki, Izuku could guess would try flying across using his quirk. The blonde was physically strong but didn't know how to fight outside of throwing a punch and kicking someone while they're down. The lack of physical training was obvious to Izuku as soon as he saw the blonde. Todoroki, Izuku saw him favoring his left side, as if it physically pained him to ever have that side at the front, always turning just so that his right side was ahead of his left. The analyst could then draw the conclusion that there was a trauma, PTSD or otherwise, that would keep the dual wielder from using his fire. He did have a bucket of water up here with him, but he doubted he'd need to use it. The boy fell into a pitfall trap after the failure to use his quirk, making Izuku stifle his giggles. That was the only thing he didn't account for, expecting the stoic teen to miss that entirely, so it was super entertaining. Jiru, the sand dampened any sort of sound she would try to put through the ground, and both Hitoshi and Izuku were accustomed to sound-based quirks. Their costumes had better sound dampening than their usual earbuds, just in case they ever had a point of time they'd ever need to work with Papa. Her quirk was effectively useless, unless one wanted to count her mutations, then Hitoshi would just have to be wary of being stabbed in the eye. Kaminari, again the sand. If the boy got close enough to Shinso to use his quirk, then Shinso was on a different terrain than him PRD because of the ice-negating chemical Izuku had put in the dirt. Izuku could already confidently say that the boy wasn't going to intelligently strategize his way through this, even if it did slightly worry him that Kaminari would think of latching onto Hitoshi to stun him. Though that interesting pink on the blonde's face when he tried flirting his way around Hitoshi, who simply brainwashed him without noticing it was flirting, the poor innocent naive purple bean, was something Izuku wanted to revisit on a later date. On it went, Izuku taking notes on his classmates' quirks and strategic thinking as each one failed. The only one that got close was Yaoyorozu, but that was only because she had attempted close combat with Hitoshi. Toshi was decent at hand-to-hand combat, but his largest flaw, besides his touch aversion with strangers, was that he panicked at the slightest misstep. So that was definitely the best way to try getting past Hitoshi when not fully certain of any other traps. If his quirk were actually activated by snapping, as he had apparently fooled the class into thinking. Dad was apparently getting a kick out of it all, so that's good, Izuku guessed. Alright, Hitoshi, let them all go. The freckled boy hopped off his perch, using the rope there to slow his descent whilst reviewing his notes. Everyone here has failed this exercise, for 2 reasons. 1, you failed to retrieve the civilians. 2, you failed to work as a team. It's a raid scenario, not an infiltration. Dad, I mean, Aizawa-sensei may have said to use stealth, but in the situation I gave you, there was no stealth to be had unless you took advantage of the short distraction your teammates caused. Except none of you did. Not that you'd have gotten very far if you did, but it would have been a solid tactic. In fact, I'm a little disappointed that not even Hagakure tried to sneak past. Did you think Toshi was acting the part of a sphinx or something? I didn't see you doing anything. The purple-haired short one that Izuku was pretty sure Dad was going to expel by the end of the day complained. Izuku raised an eyebrow. And who do you think set this all up? In this scenario, Hitoshi was playing the part of the guard while I was the boss. If you managed to pass, Toshi, you would have fought me instead. But instead, every one of you plebeians fell for my traps and Toshi's quirk. If you like, we can change positions and you can attempt to keep the hostages safe from me, but I sincerely doubt your feeble intelligence would be able to if you weren't able to pass, Toshi. Izuku somehow managed to keep the grin off his face when his faked cocky tone managed to elicit the reaction he had been hoping for. Half of the class were angry, annoyed with how self-assured he was while implying their much lower intelligence, while the other half looked to be plotting ways to beat him. Hell, I even upped the ante. If you can avoid being arrested by me, you pass this lesson and your previous fail is crossed from the record. You cannot do that, Aizawa Yamada. You are not a teacher and so have no effect nor authority on our grades. Dad cleared his threat, gaining the attention of the irate teenagers glaring his son down. Hitoshi had already stepped up next to him, sipping calmly from his juice pouch that their dad had passed to him. I forgot to tell you. Nizu trained Izuku and Hitoshi. They also do his job in preparation to inherit the school from him. Aizawa scratched the side of his neck lazily, looking over at the nervous bulky hero beside him, curious about the hero's reaction. So, in a way, you're looking at the vice principal and one of Nizu's personal students. In other words, he has that authority. He can also expel someone if he likes, though it is unlikely that he will. Wait, I can what now? Sweet. Mineta Minoru, I'm expelling you as soon as I get my hands on the paperwork for it. Izuku grinned, ecstatic at his newfound powers. Aizawa blinked. I stand corrected. Anyways, I'll give everyone 20 minutes to come up with a plan to stop Izuku, then 10 minutes to set up. Come on, problem child. Izuku leaned forward, tilting his head worriedly. Should I tell them their 20 minutes is up? They haven't started setting up or anything. Dad just glanced at where Izuku was staring, snorting at the arguing going on between the small number of students that were attempting to work together. Let them fail. It'll make them realize the importance of teamwork and prioritizing. Izuku just hummed back, fidgeting with his fingers a bit. Needless to say, Izuku had the hostages out and to safety without any of the class noticing that the exercise had started. They only realized what was going on when Ojiro yelped in surprise as he was quickly incapacitated and captured from his place as a mediator. Bakugo was quickly taken down after, cursing his whole way down to the ground where his cheek was ground into the dirt by one steel-toed boot pushing on his head firmly, and the whole class just began dropping like flies. The last to be standing were Todoroki, Yaoyorozu, Uraraka, Ida, and Hagakure. Todoroki had pulled back some distance in an attempt to observe his opponent. Yaoyorozu had pulled Uraraka out of the group since the Gravity Girl was the only one in reach of the Creation Girl. Ida had utilized his engines to quickly avoid any of Izuku's attempts to grab him, and Hagakure had ditched her gloves and shoes at some point during the commotion. So far as Izuku could observe, from his spot crouching on the back of the blonde that had flirted with his Hitoshi, they were separated in 3 different directions. Assuming Hagakure was in line with one of the others, the girls were directly to Izuku's left, Ida to his right and back, and Todoroki to the front and prowling towards his right. He smiled behind his mask, content with the fact that they were wary towards him, especially since they didn't know what his quirk might be. Too bad for them, he knew their quirks quite well. Are we not going to stop this? All Might felt that he had ample reason to be worried that this tiny kid was taking down the other students that were sometimes even twice his height with ease that spoke of professional experience. Why would we do that? No one is in danger. Izuku doesn't even have that katana he asked for, and his knives are in here with Hitoshi. As if demonstrating, Hitoshi held up a belt with knives of varying sizes, from needle-thin and sharp to the size of a cleaver and dull. All Might eyed the belt incredulously. Just watch the show. The grin on Aizawa's face was almost more unnerving than knowing one of the students had free access to knives in his hero costume. I'll be taking that, thanks. The cheerful voice was at odds with the sudden uppercut kick that disarmed Yaoyorozu, the hastily made bar leaving her hands and landing in the green-haired boy's hands, before it almost immediately nearly made contact with her head. Uraraka had pulled the taller girl stumbling back, in the same way that Yaoyorozu had pulled the brunette back from the group, before she attempted to grab the boy's arm to activate her quirk. Instead of being fazed by the sudden light feeling of his jacket, he ignored it and Uraraka tried pushing more force behind her quirk while still focusing on avoiding Izuku's hits. The most she did was cause more levitation to the body of the jacket before she let her guard down enough to get a solid hit to her side, losing all her focus on her quirk as she tried to regain the breath lost. Are you okay? Yaoyorozu looked worriedly at Uraraka, who coughed a bit more as she held up a shaky thumb. The hit didn't hurt so much as it was unexpected and perfectly placed to force an exhale when she was breathing in. You know, if you want to just yield, you can go to the side like everyone else. It was a bored drawl, nimble fingers twirling the staff he had stolen as he approached the duo again. You've done remarkably well already, but it's not like you've got a tank in your pocket or anything. After all, Yaoyorozu, you're running low on calories. You should consider adding a pouch of snacks to your hero costume. It would help in situations like these. Without warning, he was on them again. It wasn't long before he had Uraraka cuffed, sitting cross-legged while she looked queasy, and Yaoyorozu had found herself in a similar position as Bakugo by being pinned on her front and her arms cuffed behind her back where she couldn't reach bare skin too well. The only difference being that his boot was in between her shoulder blades rather than on her skull. 2 down, 3 left to go. Ida had clearly taken to the idea that, if Izuku couldn't catch him, he passed the test. He was keeping himself quite the distance away, warily observing Izuku from across the training hall. Todoroki looked to be hesitating, looking hard at Yaoyorozu's pinned form in confusion. Hagakure was still very MIA. I gotta say, I'm kinda surprised. Surprised and disappointed. Izuku spoke as he stood up, making sure his voice was loud enough to be heard by both boys. One child of a pro hero? Common. Two? Now that's a bit rare. But a total of 5 hero babies in one class? Amazing, really. Pro hero Sozo, civilian name Yaoyorozu Haruto. Pro hero family Ingenium, current Ingenium civilian name Ida Tensei. Pro hero Endeavor, civilian name Todoroki Enji. Then, of course, mine and Hitoshi's fathers. But I'm disappointed. None of you live up to the family name. It was a taunt aimed at Ida, since Izuku knew the other teen was very proud to be an Ida, so it was a little surprising when the air became a bit nippy. Well, at least I angered one of them. Izuku couldn't help snorting at the affronted yet bewildered look on Ida's face before focusing his attention on Todoroki, who was glaring at him. If Izuku were the imaginative type, he might even have said the boy's glare could rival the chilliness of an ice dragon's. As it was, he could only really compare it to the glare Dad gave when someone made a quirkist comment towards Hitoshi, but Todoroki's lacked the murderous heat. What's up? Did I say something incorrect? Izuku grinned in the dual-haired boy's direction, noting how the ground around him was beginning to frost over. Oh, is it because I compared you to your father? Oh dear, that's certainly quite the problem. Endeavor, being the number 2 hero, will often be brought up around you. If you let your temper take over with such a common remark, I don't think you can be a hero. Barely finishing his review of the other teenager, he dashed forward. He couldn't help but wonder what material the support department had used to make his boots, as he used them to kick through Todoroki's ice easily, but there was always the possibility that Todoroki wasn't concentrating on the solidity of the ice as well. Regardless, it took little effort to break the ice between them and spin his way behind the other boy while he was blinded by the ice. Then, using the pole he had stolen from Yaoyorozu, he hit the pressure point on the back left of Todoroki's neck and knocked him out. Ida was the only one left. Izuku wasn't sure how to get in range of the boy. Hey Ida, any way I could get you to come over here and place the cuffs on yourself? Surely, you're joking, Aizawa-kun. The dry statement from the Megane made Izuku give a sharp laugh. Ha, the name isn't Aizawa-kun. You're not someone in their 50s talking to my dad. It's Aizawa Yamada-kun, if you insist on using my surname. Izuku tried seeing if inching forward would work, but Ida matched every movement Izuku made with his own whilst keeping himself away from being trapped in a corner. It would be highly improper and inappropriate for me to use the given name of someone I just met. Well, maybe I'd like being a tad bit inappropriate if it's with you. Izuku added a wink, more saying this because he wanted to keep a dialogue going to maybe get Ida to forget to keep moving. But, to his amazement, Ida tripped over his own feet, spluttering at the flirtatious comment as steam rose from his bright red face. Not one to waste an opportunity, Izuku sprinted to catch Ida's wrists, snapping the HNDCFFS on quickly. With that done, Izuku stepped over to the broken ice to check on the unconscious invisible girl he had accidentally kicked with the ice. She'd probably be fine? There was a quiet murmur in the room as the students nursed their bruises and egos, ice packs having been handed out among the kids by Recovery Girl since she didn't see any reason to use her quirk to heal them, but it quieted down as the one who had served them their bruises stood at the front of the class. There were a few nasty looks, but overall the others held some respect for the boy. Before the class ends, I have something to say. Quite a few students tensed up, anxious about what their teacher's son could possibly be about to say, and a couple broke into a nervous sweat. Was he going to grill them on what they should have or could have done to win the exercise? Was he going to threaten some of them with expulsion like he already had with Mineta, who had taken to hiding from Izuku, as they say, out of sight, out of mind, in the hopes that Izuku would forget about expelling him? Was he going to randomly choose someone to go one-on-one with? Was he going to blacklist them from ever being a hero? I'm really very sorry. Many brains short-circuited, trying to connect the cocky boy that had been calmly insulting them with the green-haired teen currently bowing low in front of them, and none recovered before Izuku continued. I know it's inexcusable behavior on my side, But I couldn't figure out how to encourage everyone to do their best to beat me without being mean. I fully understand if something I said may have been too upsetting or if you dislike me now. I will try my hardest to make up for it, but if you'd rather I not bother you, I can do that too. The self-assured boy had completely disappeared, leaving nothing more than a hazy memory in the wake of this anxious green-haired teen with his eyes flitting around the room and shaky hands pulling at fingers nervously. Wait, so you didn't mean anything you said in the fight? Well, no, I definitely was serious when I suggested that Yaoyorozu-san carry around calorie bars and that Todoroki-san needs to be able to keep calm when he's compared to Endeavor, but I could have said it nicer. Changing motions from pulling at his fingers to rubbing his hands together, Izuku kept his gaze firmly away from anyone else's. Like, Yaoyorozu-san, I don't know if you thought of this already, but since your quirk relies on converting calories into whatever you're making, you could get a fanny pack or thigh pouch and carry food in it for any situation where you may end up using your stockpile up? Or something like that. You know. I dunno, man. Kaminari spoke up this time, scratching at the back of his head. Some of the stuff you said was kinda uncalled for. Izuku faltered at that, stopping his anxious movements. I understand that, and I'm sorry. Since I don't have a physical quirk, I have to rely on altering the emotive state of my opponents to be able to catch them off guard. So, it worked in two different ways, making you take me seriously and giving me an advantage. Speaking of, what is your quirk? Yaoyorozu, while bitter her weapon had been taken and used against her, had a kind tone to her voice. I can gather that, Hitoshi-kuin's quirk is some sort of thought manipulation, but I don't think I saw you use your quirk. Oh, you see, Izuku stalled answering the question, glancing around and scratching at his hands as a distraction. He never did have the best reactions whenever his quirk came into play. Even if he had a quirk now, it wasn't like he could really prove it. After all, it was difficult to prove that he could speed his thoughts up to the point that he could see a hummingbird's wings flap in super slow motion, or that he could enhance any of his five senses to an almost ridiculous degree after training to do so. He's quirkless. Everyone's attention was captured by the red-eyed blonde that had spoken up. Bakugo shrugged. You looked like you needed help saying it, and it's a bit pointless to keep it hidden from the class. Why do you think the troll doll kept making those dumb quirkless jokes and comments? The three that knew the truth glanced at each other, shrugging a bit. None of them were quite motivated enough to correct the misunderstanding. Izuku, because his quirk was somewhat difficult to explain in his opinion, Shoyuta and Hitoshi because it would take effort. Wait, Bubu, how would you know that? Kirishima pushed forward, looking at the blonde curiously. Just those jokes and comments aren't really enough, you know? It's kinda mean and totally unmanly to accuse someone of such a thing. Well, I mean, I was diagnosed quirkless. Yet if one were to look up his quirk registry, it would say his quirk was analyzed and had a brief description that definitely wasn't enough in Izuku's opinion. I also grew up with Bakugo-san. Bakugo gave a near full-body twitch at the seemingly permanent name change. The student seemed to contemplate the response before an annoyed nasally voice spoke up, seemingly unconcerned over the fact he had been hiding until then. What? A quirkless loser thinks he has the power to expel someone. My quirk may be lame, but at least I have one. Mineta Minoru did not manage to avoid being expelled before the end of the day, Aizawa finishing the paperwork in record time despite his distaste for it and plopping it into the same stack as Izuku's. All Might. Come in, would you like a cup of tea? No, thank you Nizu. I just came by to ask a question or two. Oh, what about? The quirkless boy? Don't you think it's dangerous for him to be in the hero course? I mean, I've seen that he can defend himself against untrained students but dash. You're talking about the kid? Izuku-kun, yes? I believe so. Aizawa-kun's shorter child, though I do wonder how either boy is related to either Aizawa-kun or Yamada-kun. Yagi, you have heard of adoption, correct? Regardless, the kid is perfectly capable with or without a quirk. It's been a delight personally teaching him. You personally taught the boy? Of course. He's the most intelligent test student that I've ever met. Aizawa-kun also trained both boys. I see. Izuku frowned, staring down the hallway. Dad? Did I do something to make All Might avoid me? Shoyuta looked in the same direction Izuku was, seeing nothing, before shrugging. Who knows what's going on in that idiot's head? Come on, Hitoshi is most likely already on the training ground with Nemuri. We don't want a repeat of the last time they were alone together. Oh come on, it wasn't that bad. Hitoshi managed to dye his hair pink. They weren't even messing with hair dye. Or anything pink. But you gotta admit it looked good on him. Izuku tapped his chin thoughtfully. I wonder what I would look like with pink hair? Let's not find out, please. Izuku grinned. Maybe I should ask Papa what he thinks. Shoyuta groaned. Is he still staring at me? The first real day of school was over, finding Izuku back in the now nearly empty cafeteria tinkering with an electronic he was trying to fix and his brother sitting across from him with a book in hand. There was also a particular blonde across the room. Hitoshi hummed his agreement, making Izuku slam the tool he was using onto the table and stand up, stomping his way over to the now panicked-looking blonde. Izuku smiled serenely, despite how irritated he now was. Bakugo, is there a reason that you're staring me down from halfway across a large room that, may I remind you, is free to leave? I what? I'm not staring at you. Izuku pinched the bridge of his nose. Did Bakugo Katsuki think he was an idiot? The answer was probably yes, since the blonde had insulted his intelligence many times when they were younger. When we were younger God, I sound like Papa when he talks about his high school days. Then what, pray tell, are you looking at? Because if it's Hitoshi, I will kindly request you to look elsewhere. He didn't want Bakugo trying to interact with his brother, for multiple reasons. First and foremost, the other teen had severe anger issues, regardless of the fact that Bakugo was apparently going to therapy for that, and his brother had a different healing process than Izuku had. Hitoshi still flinched if Papa's voice reached a certain level, something both parties felt bad about for different reasons, and on bad days it could send him into a panic or anxiety attack. Bakugo had already shown in class that he still had volume issues, luckily never near Hitoshi. I'm not looking at the freaking troll doll. That was another reason, the blonde never seemed to call others by their actual name. Mom wants me to, she wants you over for dinner. You know, since you think I'm staring at you. Izuku frowned. Why in any deity's name would Bakugo Mitsuki want Izuku over for dinner? She didn't notice that Katsuki was unnecessarily violent towards Izuku. She hadn't visited when Inko had upped her work hours and scheduled it so Izuku and she never interacted. She hadn't done anything before he was put up for adoption nor while he was in that orphanage, and she hadn't even attempted to get in contact with him after the Aizawa Yamada couple had adopted him. So, from Izuku's point of view, there wasn't any reason to accept the invitation. Not to mention that Mitsuki's personality was boiled down to the two words, loud and violent. Two things Izuku didn't care for much anymore. Yes, he understood the irony of disliking loudness yet having present Mike as his papa. It just wasn't something he associated with Yamada Hisashi, since the man had toned that down for his too anxious charges early on and only ended up too loud when excited about something. Generally, though, his excitement was met with an equal enthusiasm from said anxious charges. I don't think I'm willing to do that. Izuku turned, expecting to be left to walk away, when Bakugo spoke up again. Mom has therapy to... She said something about it being a requirement from someone that showed up about a year after Auntie Inko passed, but wouldn't give me more details than that. She's doing a lot better than I am at it, if that's what you're worried about. That was curious. Both loud Bakugos in therapy? That seemed a bit strange from Izuku's point of view. Irregardless, I would rather not feel forced to play at domesticity with someone I haven't seen since you began bullying me before elementary. Bakugo grimaced at the reminder, shifting uncomfortably, before reluctantly nodding. Hitoshi watched with a nearly intense stare as Izuku walked back to him, presumably having watched the whole interaction with the bookmark holding his place, and the shorter brother sighed as he sat back down. A quick glance confirmed that the blonde had wasted little to no time in retreating. It's so hard. Shoyuta contemplated for a moment, looking at the pouting preteen across from him. A thought had been hovering in the back of his head, but he wasn't sure how to confirm it. Why won't my stupid fingers do what I tell them to? Hitoshi appeared to be at a similar loss as Shoyuta, helplessly watching as Izuku scratched his head in frustration. It shouldn't be this hard. I know what it means, I know what I'm trying to say, so why does it feel impossible? Izuku, it's okay. Let's calm down, take a step back and slow dash. No. I have to do this. It was the first time Izuku had snapped at either Shoyuta or Hisashi, the first time he had interrupted either one of them as well, and the first time Shoyuta had seen Izuku look so scared and nervous since the first time they met. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, please, I'm sorry dash. Shoyuta took a moment to decide his words, picking them as carefully as he kept his hands firmly on the table. He lowered his voice to something that sounded that little bit more soothing to himself, hoping it worked for the kid. Izuku, you're okay. You're just a little frustrated, so let's both just calm down and step back a bit. Take a deep breath with me. Shoyuta paused talking to take an exaggerated breath in, Izuku hesitantly copying the motion. Now breathe out. After completing the action, Izuku seemed a bit less frazzled, so Shoyuta cautiously continued to speak. Izuku, can you explain to me why this is so frustrating for you? Izuku seemed to withdraw a bit, causing Shoyuta to be a bit more concerned about the potential reason. You said that you have to do this, why is that? Izuku slid down in the chair a bit, his fingers playing with a nearby pen. Shoyuta waited a moment to see if Izuku would respond more than closing himself off, while thinking of reasons why Izuku would be so upset about this. One thought stuck out more than the others. Do you feel that we will abandon you if you can't do something? The hitched breath and rising shoulders confirmed that question. Shoyuta was out of his element in this scenario, glancing at the clock nearby to see that it'd be another hour and a half before Hisashi was done with his show. This felt like something that shouldn't. It felt like he couldn't leave it until Hisashi got back. Izuku, look at me please? Shoyuta waited for Izuku to finally look up. You're perfect as you are. Izuku, you can see such minute details that we now have 10 more years before Hisashi is predicted to lose his hearing, that's 20 whole years. We may even be able to find something to reverse the damage in that amount of time. It took one sentence from you for Recovery Girl to make a breakthrough on a new formula for my eye drops. There's no reason for me to think you aren't intelligent, Izuku. But even if you weren't, we would still, care for you anyway. The L word was still a bit taboo yet, but Hisashi was having more of an issue with being not allowed to casually say it in conversation. Hound Dog had told them that said word could be upsetting to hear for adoptees. But dash. Shoyuta shook his head, cutting Izuku off. No, that's. Hisashi cares about you, I care about you, Hitoshi cares for you, none of us don't want you here.